Welcome to episode 70 of The Human Experience and the last episode of 2024. It's hard to believe as time is flying, but this podcast has been live for almost 2 years. Together, we've told 70 stories, visited 21 countries and 12 states, and have had countless adventures. And there is so much more to come. Thank you for being a part of this journey with me. Thank you for valuing the vulnerability and courage of these storytellers. Through the month of December, I've released replay episodes of The Human Experience. 2024 was quite a year for me personally, and I needed the extra time to recalibrate and dial into the present. I really appreciate your continued support as I took this break, but now I'm looking toward 2025 and I'm excited about the possibilities a new year brings. I don't know about you, but I love the idea of a fresh start. Admittedly, I'm entirely too idealistic about the whole thing, but a blank slate is just too irresistible. There is so much potential in a new year. It reminds me that change is not only good, it's necessary. Change to me represents hope and growth and infinite possibilities. As this episode is being released on New Year's Eve, I thought it would be fun to recap some of my old episodes. Some of these clips are more than 2 or 3 years old. And while that doesn't sound like a lot of time in the grand scheme of things, quite a lot has happened in the span of those years. Sometimes I think the reason we're so afraid of change is because we don't really realize how much of it we're doing on a daily basis. So while I'm all for living in the present moment and planning for the future, I also think there's incredible value in looking back. To look back is to see how far you've come. To close the book on chapters of your life that are no longer relevant in order to make way for something new. So before we usher in a brand new year of travel and stories and adventure, here's a look back at the early days of the human experience, along with some brand new insight from yours truly. I'm wishing you peace as you close the book on 2024 and hope as we begin this chapter of 2025. Happy New Year. Listening back to this clip from episode 2, Implosion, is really interesting. I've been involved in domestic violence advocacy for about 8 years, including co-hosting a radio program about domestic violence called Suffering in Silence. But as I was listening to this, it struck me how much bolder I've become in telling my story. It's still not comfortable and not something I especially enjoy reliving, but through my podcast and subsequently being a guest on others' podcasts, I feel like I've found my unique voice. What I absolutely love is the idea and the motivation behind the human experience is truer now more than ever. Stories matter, and they will continue to transcend the bad and the ugly in this world, because even stories of sorrow hold glimmers of hope within them. Domestic violence changed my life. It changed who I was, fundamentally. I look back at the person I was before I got married, and I'm sad for her. She's about to know things she can't unknow, things about humanity and its ugliness. But while domestic violence doesn't define me, it's still a part of me, and I won't pretend otherwise. The lens that I saw the world through had shattered. I came from a conservative Christian upbringing. I never really had a rebellious phase. I got along with my parents, especially my mom. I had friends and I was involved in activities. I grew up dreaming of falling in love, getting married, becoming a mom. Even as a teenager, I wanted that for myself. I vividly remember combing through future career paths and considering how my choices would affect the kids I wanted to have in the future. I did all the right things. I made the right choices. And yet, if I was to introduce myself today to my younger self, she would be in shock. Never did I think that this was where I would be. I was certain that I knew myself well enough to know what I'd want forever. But life changes you, as it should. If we don't grow year to year, decade to decade, I think that's an even sadder reality. But while I don't believe that it should be trauma that is the force of change, it's unfortunately the case for many. I'm now in my 30s. I'm well past my marriage. And honestly, I'm great. I love my life and I love who I am. But what I want out of life has totally changed. And what I value has totally changed. and the way I see everything around me has changed. I wear the change as a badge of honor. Truly, I do, because it took a lot of work to get here. I am not, nor will I ever be perfect. But that's not the point. When I said I hated myself, I meant it. Even after I left, while thoughts of hurting myself had gone, I still wrestled with existing in a space where everything felt wrong, from my body to my mind, from my relationship with God to my relationship with people around me. Healing isn't linear, and it took me years to get to a place where I felt confident again. It wasn't just the abusive relationship, nor was it the navigation of a society that really doesn't know what to do with trauma. It was the grieving of everything that I thought my life was going to be, all the plans I had made. It was figuring out who I was, and giving myself permission to change and change and change again. Each metamorphosis a lesson in love and liberation. No, things have not gone the way that I thought they would have. Life has certainly thrown some curveballs. But make no mistake, there was joy and triumph in every season, even when the sadness and anger were more prevalent. Every endeavor and encounter has been a stepping stone. I've done a lot of things in my relatively short life. Objectively, things that wouldn't have necessarily happened if I didn't take the paths that I took. All of that has culminated into this singular project, the human experience. Everything we experience in our lives contributes to who we are. We have a unique lens that no other person has access to. It informs our principles and it awakens our compassion. It's what makes us human. Not just the ability to recall and share our stories, but the feelings they evoke, the magic they carry. There's a reason that people have been sharing stories in one way or another since the beginning. There's a reason that stories stand the test of time. We are curious and we are contemplative. But more than that, we always return to community. It was my walk through my own experiences of domestic violence that sparked this tiny flame years ago. A flame so weak I didn't even know what to do with it. That flame is now a roaring fire, one I hope burns for a long time. If I could change so much because of one experience I had in my life, how might my other experiences have informed who I am? And if I've walked through that, then that means every single other person has as well. Which means that no two stories are the same, and no two people have the same perspective. And what a beautiful thing to know, that there are endless stories to be told. I'm equal parts terrified and exhilarated to be releasing this. The past couple of years have been spent preparing for this very moment. I hope you find the value in story. I hope you see the humanity in the vulnerability that's shared here. I hope you recognize the generosity of spirit of those who are willing to speak their truth. Mostly though, I hope this helps you understand that you are not alone. Episode 4 is one of my favorite that I've ever recorded. It's one that I often recommend to people when they're asking for episode recommendations to start the podcast. Joe is a friend of mine. He's the kind of guy that knows and is friends with everyone. He's easy and fun to be around, as well as being a great person. But you wouldn't necessarily know what Joe has been through in his life. He's a great example of you never really know what anyone else's life has looked like. Joe isn't a pushover. He's a physically intimidating person. So to hear him be vulnerable about his experience with domestic violence was so important. And honestly, I'm so proud of him for being willing to be so candid. He had never told his story before, at least not on a platform like this. The other thing about Joe's story is that there are some major updates. When we first recorded his episode, he and his wife had just taken custody of their niece and nephew. It's been a couple of years since then, and Joe and his wife have officially adopted them. It's been an often difficult road for their family, but Joe and his wife made the decision to stop the cycle of abuse for these kids. And we'll be recording a follow-up episode with him, so look out for that in 2025.
I didn't really have anything to look forward to. I felt like I didn't want to continue down like everything that was going on, because when I would voice my opinions or my distaste, I would be met with like, oh, you're ungrateful, did all this for you guys. And now as an adult, I get it. But at the time, I was just in such a dark place. I'm not going to get into details, but when like I came through everything, I don't ever want to make anyone feel like that, like ever. I had to break that. I didn't want anyone else getting to that low of a point in their life because of me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah, I just had to stop it. I've also adapted that in other things. Like if I see someone picking on someone who's like smaller than them, weaker, or maybe someone who just doesn't have like a strong enough voice to stick up for themselves, I will 100% intervene at whatever cost it is. You know what I mean? Which is what I'm doing. What I decided to do right now with my niece and nephew. They were going to go into Philly foster care, and I just, because they're victims. They were victims of physical abuse, 100%, neglect, and all that. And I just don't like. I never wanted to feel powerless, which is probably why I get up at 5 a.m. and lift weights 5 days a week. But like, I didn't want anyone else to feel powerless or feel that like I wouldn't protect them if given the opportunity. Yeah. So that's when I just ended it all. None of my kids will ever be disciplined in the way I was. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I know I didn't answer the question probably totally.
No. That was great.
It's
an incredible thing to move from, having that experience and making that decision and then actually being able to follow through with that. It really is incredible because patterns of behavior that we learn, especially when we're young, they're very easy to fall into and fall back into. And it takes a lot of work to decide to do something differently. Do you think that the people that raised you, I mean, obviously your parents, but the people you were around when you were younger and even their elders, their parents and stuff, do you think they would have described that behavior as abusive?
I don't know, because my grandma on my mom's side was like, she shot somebody before. She was pretty hardcore. Like I know. A guy was trying to break into the house and she shot him in the back and in the ass while he was running away.
Wow.
Yeah. I think she paralyzed him, if I remember correctly. So I guess they wouldn't. My grandma would say stuff all the time to me, like my dad's mom. She watched me when I was a kid. She passed away when I was 10, the day before Christmas Eve. She would say stuff. She would say stuff to my aunt, too, the one I told you that would say stuff to me all the time. Yeah. Yeah, she would.
Well, and that's what it is, right? Yeah. Like, so your aunt got it from her mom, who then passed it on to you. Yeah. And not that that's in any way excusable, but we see the patterns through generations. Yeah. And a lot of times I think what's so interesting is, especially when we go back, it's like whatever was, we were talking earlier about what's socially and culturally acceptable. Yeah. So back then it wasn't abusive to talk to and treat your kids like that necessarily. And now we know better. We now know how much damage that can do to a person, no matter what age they are. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation about the cycle of abuse, but also defining what abuse is and what abusive behavior is.
I prefer the physical abuse over the verbal when I was a kid. Because the physical I would heal from quicker. The verbal stuck with me a lot. You know what I mean? It would like repeat to me. Whereas if I got punched in the face or, whipped with a belt or pushed down the steps or whatever, and get up, brush it off and be fine. Which also, getting hit by a 30-something-year-old man who's like, 200-something pounds and really strong, I get into a fight at school, it's like nothing. So that was the only, I guess, benefit of the physical abuse. Like, you think you punch harder? Like, come on, bro. Like, but yeah. This went from ancestry to like really dark, really fast.
No, this is your story. This is it. And then I think it's why what happened through ancestry means so much to you.
Yeah, it's like a second chance for me. Oh, like I said, I still talk to my mom and dad. They're welcome at my house whenever, you know what I mean? My kids go there from time to time. I don't send my son as much. I feel like they're not equipped to handle my son because like he's high energy 8-year-old, like wants to play, wants to be rough, like stuff like that. So my daughter just lays on her couch or bed and watches TikToks. So it's like she can go down there.
Yeah.
But if they did go down there and they came back and I was told they said something, that would definitely be an issue. If anyone were to cross the line stuff, I still hold that part of it in me. You know what I mean? Like that part of the resentment in me. So.
And I think that's fair. I also think it's awesome that you said out loud the fact that the psychological and verbal abuse was a lot harder to deal with than the physical abuse because we're still not fully understanding that. That, you know, of course, physical abuse is not acceptable and is never okay, but it doesn't touch the damage that psychological abuse does.
Yeah, without a doubt. You can recover from a busted lip or like a bruised rib or whatever. It's the stuff that you're called that makes you feel like lower than dirt that sticks with you.
Yeah. The removal of your dignity.
Yeah, basically.
Sure.
There was one time my dad, I don't know, maybe I was 7, trying to make me wear a diaper because he said I was a baby. Yeah, outside of the house. Yeah. And I remember I went and got a baseball bat and was going to hit him with it. And like, that was the whole thing. Like, yeah. But yeah, all stuff I wouldn't carry on to.
When I started The Human Experience, I began with people I knew. The idea for this podcast, creating a platform for storytelling, was so massive, and the only place I knew to start was with people that I was friends with, or at least had been acquainted with. I am especially grateful to all of those people that entrusted me with their stories with absolutely no idea what would come of it. Now, if I approach someone about doing an interview, they can go to my website and listen to previous episodes to get a feel for it. They can also talk to previous guests to ask about their experience if they wanted to. But my first interviews were really trusting on a wish and a prayer because I had no idea what I was doing or even how I was going to do it. I knew Sue, but I hadn't spoken to her in several years when I reached out to ask her if I could interview her. And I will never forget how kind she was and how seriously she took me. It surprised me how much other people believed in my vision. And it was one of the things that really motivated me to get the podcast off the ground in the first place. Sue's story was one that had been in the news. And she's a no-nonsense businesswoman and founder of a nonprofit for victims and survivors of human trafficking. So her willingness, along with many others, to see the value in the human experience and to trust that I would handle their story with care is something that will always stay with me.
We had to sit in a room to prep before we went into the courtroom. And I would not look at any of them. I couldn't.
Is this the first time you met all of them? Okay.
Yes, first time I'd ever seen them. And I had asked my DA if I had to be in that room. And she said, you don't have to. And then I thought, okay, if we're all going into court, but I couldn't look at them. I was so angry. I was shaking. I knew I had to read my victim impact statement. I knew he would be in the courtroom 10 feet from me in shackles. And the whole day, my brain, it was like it was being short-circuited. I just couldn't process it all. And, a year later, and, when it happened to me, my son was graduating from Virginia Tech in 10 days. So I had to drive down there and put all this behind me for him, for his graduation. Now it's a year later. My daughter's graduating from University of Delaware in like a week. And now I'm, back in this trauma all over again in a courtroom. So long story short, we went into the courtroom. I read my victim impact statement. And afterwards, every victim came up, cried, put their arms around me, put their head buried in my neck and cried, and asked me if I would forgive them and apologized.
Wow.
Now, would you want to be the person who carried that guilt inside of you when you already are carrying the trauma of being victimized? You are now taking an overload. You're taking a double hit when you choose to suffer in silence. Because not only are you suffering, but there will be a day when you think about what could have happened if you had pushed past that. We all have an internal strength that we don't even know we have. But if you're not willing to try to rise up to the human spirit inside of you, then I don't know that it's going to feel good weeks and years later when you suppressed it. You can't tuck away trauma. That trauma needs to come out in order for you to address it. What I would highly recommend is anybody that has been victimized. I was fortunate and my daughter was here and I had to confront it because she's right there in front of me. So I didn't have a choice. I had to tell somebody. I tried to tell somebody when I called my friend, but I couldn't speak. Tell one person. It doesn't matter if it's a family member, a friend, a spouse, a pastor, an advocate at a crime victim center. Tell one person. The number of women, the victims that day in court, telling me they never told their husband, telling me they never told anyone. That is like planting a bomb inside of yourself, and it's ticking. It's just a slow, torturous drip. But when you tell someone, it's the beginning of the release of that pressure. And then I would suggest get in a support group. Start telling more people. Mine happened because I got an overdose that day by having to tell 3 reporters. First I sat and told Katie Baker the story in a Philadelphia restaurant. And then, a couple months had passed, and then I ended up telling the story many, many more times after that. I've told my story so many times that I can tell you with certainty there's no sting. There's no feeling at all. It's as if I am telling you the story of another person, because to your point, you already said this, it was another person. It's not me now. No, will I ever be that person again? Absolutely not.
Oh, goodness. I knew Winnie for approximately 2 days before doing this interview in Kenya. Prior to that, most of the interviews I'd done had been with people I'd known better, or at least for longer. This was my first experience of someone I didn't know being so open with their story. It was also one of my most pinch-me moments, as this string of interviews in Kenya were the first I got to do outside of the U.S. It was most definitely one of my I can't believe this is my life moments, and I feel so fortunate to say that I've had quite a few of those over the past few years. Winnie's story is also one that has stuck with me so poignantly. I have never witnessed, let alone been subject to, the human suffering that she spoke about while she was working in the refugee camp. And to be honest, it's an interview I revisit a lot in my head, as talk about refugees and illegals gets thrown around casually at best. Winnie, along with her student Amin, who I did an interview with in episode 10, gave so much with their vulnerability and candor, and I will forever be grateful for the window they both offered into a reality that so many live out each day.
Working in refugee camps, it's something that not everybody will experience.
Actually, I can say it's made me to be who I am. I think it started from there. Apart from an awesome childhood, working at the refugee camps has been top of the experiences that have molded me to be who I am.
Yeah.
One of them I can say is, and I know it's hard for you to say I am humble, but that is where I learned humility.
Sure.
I learned so much, as a Kenyan, as an African, you think the West people, white people have the wealth, everything they need. But then when you go to the refugee camp and you've been feeling like you don't have much, and then you realize, in fact, you have more than what they do. It was the first time that I was exposed to statelessness. Because refugees, they don't have a country.
Right.
Not all of them can go back to their mother countries, and the host country, which is Kenya, doesn't want them as citizens. So they're not citizens. So it was the first time I heard of stateless persons, and the reality of what that means really shocked me.
Yeah.
Because I've always had an identity. I am a Kenyan, and I cannot begin to imagine what it would mean not able to say that I am Kenyan.
Yeah.
Or not have a place to call home. So yeah, that was really shocking. It changed my whole mentality about how identities are formed. It changed my whole perspective, really.
Yeah.
And then just gratefulness, really. Having my family, some of the people I worked with, they didn't even know. Imagine meeting a woman who doesn't know where their sons are.
Yeah.
Or one of their kids, is he dead? Is he alive? Because probably they were forced to run in the middle of the night. And in the chaos, you lose your kids.
Sure.
And then you get to the border and realize I don't have all my kids. And I can't go back because chances of dying are really, really high. So we had families that had adopted kids they didn't know, but also don't know where their own kids are. So
Wow.
that was really tough. And then finally, still on gratefulness, refugees are given identity cards called, well, I can't even call them identity cards. They're called ration cards. It just shows this is a card. This family has 6 people. So they just write family size 6. So it shows when you go to the World Food Program to queue for food, it shows that whoever is holding that card will get food for 6 people. The UN does have their names and their details, but it's not like your driver's license, which shows who you are. It's just a card that you use to, let me use this word, beg.
Yeah.
Queue for food. And I may not come from a rich family, but I've never had to queue for food.
Yeah.
My mom, my dad always provided more than enough. And sometimes we even had extra to give to my cousins or my neighbors. I've never lacked anything. I've never not slept in a bed. Refugees do not have beds. They sleep on the floor, you know? And just that reality was so life turning for me, like a whole shift, a whole paradigm shift in terms of perspective.
Yeah.
And I was able to see life in a different way that I had never been exposed to before. So that is why I'm super, super grateful that I went there. I worked there because now I view myself as a refugee rights activist. I know I'm not actively working with refugees, but I see people talking ill of refugees, Kenyan police harassing refugees. And it just really, really infuriates me.
I don't think that leaves you after an experience like that, after those bonds are formed. I don't think that leaves you, even if you're not in the trenches at the moment.
Exactly. And I wasn't even doing much, I may say, because, I'm just teaching English and doing counseling, collecting refugee stories, etc. But
yeah, but that is much. That's more when your physical needs aren't being met. It's really difficult to get into the emotional and spiritual aspect of it because it doesn't matter as much. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
But when people consistently show up, that matters.
Yeah.
And proximity matters.
If I may add something, I really grew and matured at that time, including also my tolerance, because before I had never worked with people of a different religion.
Yeah.
I was only exposed all my growing up in high school. We had a few Muslims, but I never interacted with them as much. But here was, especially in the Dab, with 99% of the refugees coming from Somalia and embracing their culture, which is very closely entwined in with their religion. So being able to make friends, like friends that are really close to me right now. This young woman, she was my student and brilliant, high sense of humor. She was really sharp and she got a scholarship to Canada. When she comes to Kenya, she must see me. I must see her. We're that close. And some of them still in close contact, always talking, chatting, even though I'm not at the refugee camp. So great friendships that I made with Somali women, and it really grew into understanding and not just tolerating, but understanding another culture and religion and loving them and them loving me. Because it's not just the other side of the spectrum, it's them accepting and loving me as well.
Yeah.
And despite our differences, being able to live and interact and enjoy each other's company. So that was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I say it was my favorite experience, really.
Ro and Bree are two of my favorite people that I've met. I love them so much. They were friends of a friend of a friend, and they were part of the crew that trusted me to take their story and run with it without really knowing what it would turn into. I drove to Toledo to interview them, and we did it in this back room of a coffee shop. The shop was totally awesome. Shout out to Sip Toledo. But I hadn't recorded with more than 2 people before doing their interview, and I only had 2 mics. So I wasn't really sure how to solve that issue, so I just rolled with it. They had a mic sitting between them and I had mine. And I have to laugh listening back to the sound now. This was also before I had anyone engineering the sound, so the white noise in the back is especially noticeable. And I've learned and gotten better. But what I think is so interesting is even listening back to the staticky sound, no one ever said anything because the story was more important. Now, I'm a big believer in having decent equipment and doing your best to mitigate annoying things that would interrupt the listener experience. As a podcast listener myself, there have been shows that I've had to stop listening to because of it. But what it reinforced for me was that I didn't need to be in a studio with thousands of dollars of equipment to make this work. Authentic storytelling and genuine connection carve a path that is effortless to follow. Rowan Bree's notion of loving people well has been a mantra I repeat often. And I have more than a few items from their sustainable clothing line that are staples in my wardrobe.
And when you get into a rhythm, you forget that anything can happen at any second. Then when something forcefully happens to stop everyone, you reevaluate. I often tell people, especially now, take time, even if you schedule time, to reevaluate things every so often without being forced to reevaluate them. Am I loving well? Am I living on purpose? Am I kind to people? Am I treating my wife right? Am I treating my husband right? Am I treating my kids right? My family, my friends? Am I loving people well? Because it takes a funeral sometimes for us to go, gosh, I need to change a couple things about myself. Why wait for that? And it's something that we've lived forever, is above everything, love people well. And if you need to stop and reevaluate your situation, do it before you're forced to do it. So when those times come, they're still not easy to walk through. But you're thinking, okay, I didn't miss out on something that I wanted to do well or to love people well. Yeah. A legacy that we leave is love. When you're gone, there are only a few things you can leave behind, and love's one of the biggest ones because it impacts so many people.
It's how you leave people.
Yeah.
It matters.
Oh, absolutely. That's really beautiful. This episode breaks my heart. Maureen is a dear friend of mine, and her battle with long COVID has been absolute hell. It's hard because for so many people, COVID is nothing but a blip on their radar. But for others, it changed the entire trajectory of their lives. And not just people with long COVID, but those who lost people to COVID or lost their jobs or found that working in the healthcare field was no longer for them after working through a global pandemic. In reality, COVID changed the world, and trying to go backwards is like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Many of us have been able to distance ourselves from the fallout of COVID, and I think it's difficult to remember that there are people who will never be able to move on. Maureen's story was a sobering reminder that not all stories wrap up with a tidy bow. Many of them are messy with uncertain outcomes. I'm proud of Maureen and the fact that she wakes up every day. Sometimes that's the most difficult decision of all. I hope and pray for healing and for breakthrough, but I know that it's an exhausting and lonely road that she walks. And there are many like her. And I keep you all in my thoughts and my prayers. I don't know what it's like to walk through that kind of debilitating illness. And not just the physicality of it, but the mental toll it takes to just move through a world that is not made to accommodate you. I'm sorry. And I hope that we can do better.
So when did it move from just the physical symptoms to the cognitive stuff? Like, when did you notice?
I knew in May. I mean, that's soon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
March 13th.
So
I had my first physical symptom. May.
Yeah.
I knew something was going a little wrong.
Okay. So it wasn't just a resurgence of your prior symptoms. It was something completely different.
I mean, March 13th, I was sick.
Mm-hmm.
Later in May, I knew something was up. It wasn't just motivation. It wasn't just exhaustion.
Okay.
But the exhaustion was the only thing that I could say possibly maintained. And by exhaustion, I don't mean like I'm a little tireder by the end of the day. I mean, it hits you like a Mack truck.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a drug kicked in. Like I wake up in pain every day. Like before where I had back pain from the fibro, it is in every single joint in my body. The top knuckles of my fingers hurt sometimes more than anything else, more than my back. There's times that I look at my right wrist, which I actually did break in college when I was dancing. There's times where I look at it and I imagine the delight in cutting off my right hand.
Yeah.
I can't use my cane anymore because my wrists won't hold me up.
Mm-hmm.
I miss my cane. I can't use a walker because of my shoulders, my elbows, and my wrists.
Yeah. What good is leaning on something if it hurts?
Right.
And this is all symptomatic of long haul.
Mhm.
This isn't anything like,
No.
oh, this happened to be happening on top of it. This is all a symptom of the long haul.
And whether that changes your cognitive issues or not still remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Because not enough people have really connected all these dots yet. And not enough people have exactly the same symptoms and exactly the same treatment.
You joined a study, correct?
No, I joined a great long haul COVID clinic, Penn.
Okay.
And
a
then
clinic. Sorry.
I had great people who volunteered to help pack up and clean out and fix up my house so I could sell it so that money was not my biggest worry.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't follow through on all the treatments that Penn wanted me to do. I instead just focused on getting the house sold. And Penn wanted me to go to Penn X-ray places and Penn blood places and all that kind of stuff.
And you weren't driving.
I wasn't driving, and my primary and my cardiologist are mainline people.
Okay.
So I moved to a place directly across from a mainline hospital because Mainline Health opened a COVID clinic. And I will say proud, I will say strong that Mainline's COVID clinic is not a program. It's a printout. It's the worst excuse for healthcare that I can possibly describe. It is an excuse to take grant money.
Wow.
The coordinators will tell you that your insurance doesn't cover something like OT or PT when it does. They're overwhelmed. They don't even want to be prepared for it. They're just set up so that you continue to use their own doctors and they collect the information. And I signed a lease. I moved in here to take advantage of this. It doesn't have to be highbrow. It doesn't have to be engraved in gold. I just want a little help.
Yeah.
I'm not getting it. So now I'm back to Penn. And so when I called to make that appointment, I think it was the end of June, my next appointment with the very wonderful Dr. Abramoff, who tried everything and I wasn't making time for them. My appointment is in November
Of this year.
for an assessment. That's on me. That's 100% on me. Because now everybody is hearing this and they're like, wow, I'm exhausted too. I must have long haul. I talked to an Uber driver who told me that, yeah, I had long haul. Yeah, I had that a couple of weeks ago. He said, yeah, I had long haul for about like 3 months. It ended a couple of weeks ago. He had COVID about a year ago. If I'm having this much trouble describing what long haul is, can you imagine how a newspaper reporter, or worse yet, somebody like in the news on a 60-second bit is going to be able to describe it?
Right.
So no wonder people are confused. No wonder that Uber guy thought, you can have long haul like a little reprise, like
Right.
a little,
Resurgence, and then it goes away. And yeah. And
right.
what it is, like just exhaustion or just some of your physical symptoms that you had when you were sick, and not the cognitive stuff
Right.
that goes along with it.
Right. Or the eye stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have peripheral phantom visions that used to just be low. It was like I used to think I'd see like a mouse or something bigger than a mouse, like maybe a tiny dog, like a chihuahua, out of the corners of my eyes. And then I thought it was my glasses. So I went back to wearing another pair of older glasses. No, still seeing them. Well, then they started high. Like I thought I was seeing a bat or a bird. And apparently, yeah, this is very common among other people with cognitive issues. I have hearing loss in one ear. I have like a constant hum. They call it tinnitus. To me, it sounds more like a hiss, like when air is escaping from your tire.
Yeah.
And I am completely intolerant now of being in a restaurant where somebody else around me is on their speaker, on their phone. I can't stand that.
Is it the static of that
Not the
bothers
static, just the volume. Yeah. It's distractions of all kinds.
you? Okay.
I have a lot of trouble focusing. And I mean, I used to run a telemarketing room. I had to be able to hear somebody mispronouncing like Rachmaninoff in one corner, where somebody else is mispronouncing Dvorak on the other side.
Yeah.
You know, I loved a full phone room where I could hear everything going on. Now, if it's one thing and somebody's talking to me, I can't handle it. And that hit me immediately.
In March or in
No,
May?
like Mayish.
Okay.
May into June.
Gotcha. You had mentioned before that people that have long haul are sharing online their experiences and everything like that. Have you been able to find community in that?
Yes.
Reluctant, yes.
I'm a big fake. Being one of the early ones, I really thought this was going to be a short-term thing. I never, ever, ever would have imagined that I would still be here feeling this way.
This was a special interview with the founders of Firm Foundations Romania. I've been volunteering with the organization since 2010, and the women behind the nonprofit have become dear friends of mine. I've spent more time in Romania than any other place I've traveled, and even after 14 years, I continue to be drawn to the beauty of it. While I was traveling this summer, I based myself in Romania, feeling easily at home there. This interview definitely felt like a full circle moment for me, to be able to elevate a story I knew so well, having heard it and even told it myself many times over. It also highlights that in some ways, I think it's more difficult to interview your friends sometimes. It's hard not to let your own lens cloud theirs when your stories weave in and out of each other's for so many years.
To be honest, for me, it's not a sacrifice. For me, it's actually an honor to be doing this work. Like every time I go back home and I see people and see their problems they have, I'm like, oh goodness, get me back to Romania. So for me personally, it is not a sacrifice at all.
Yeah.
Of course, it was the first year or two when you're like, I was young 20s, but then after that, it just became my life. Like I wouldn't want anything else at this point.
I agree. It also has been a joy to do this sort of service work. You know, there's times though, I thought like the what ifs.
Yeah.
You know, what might have been, what could have been. Did I miss the boat with marriage? Did I miss the boat with a music career? But I've come to terms with the choices I've made and a conclusion that I am so grateful for sticking it through and being a part of this movement of missions and becoming a missionary entrepreneur, especially with these girls and the rest of our FFR team. Life is choices and we can't have our cake and eat it too all the time. But overall, I'm very grateful to be still in this work in Romania.
That's why she wrote a whole song about Russia.
That's one of my lines in one of my songs, thinking about my own hometown. Sometimes I wonder what I'm missing now. Then the soft breeze flows, whispering, you have to let it go. Like, let go of the past. You made this decision. You made these decisions. The fruits of it have been wonderful. Just keep planning and moving forward.
Yeah. No, that's so true. It's beautiful. You know, when I first started coming out, you had very few Romanian people wanting to be involved in what you're doing. And now 10, 12, 15 years later, all of your teachers are Romanian or even Roma. You have built such great relationships with the staff at the hospital. And I think it speaks to a lot of your dedication to being here and being present. But what has that been like for you guys to see the growth and the fruit of that, you know, just constantly pouring back into the community and actually seeing the community come around and gather around you?
You're right. You're right. 10, 15 years ago, Romanian volunteers were scarce. It wasn't the thing to do. During communism, people didn't volunteer their time. They had to work for their time. They didn't have enough money to volunteer and help others. And I think it's more of a mentality change that has happened. And Romanians are more secure, financially secure, and the younger generation is understanding how beneficial volunteering is. And as we've grown, we've been able to employ Romanians now. So that's the neat thing. And I mean, we hope that in years to come, that Romanians will eventually take over Firm Foundations Romania. I mean, we're not going to live forever. But that's kind of the really cool thing about working in a country like this, is seeing cultural change and mentality changes. And through prayer, God is moving.
And I think that's a really good point. You're so close to communism. It's not like some of the other things that have happened in history, right? I mean, 1989 was the first break from that. And you have multiple generations that have lived through communism still alive today. And the further away you get, the more open to cultural change, I think people are. But it's hard, especially when you've been through something so painful and so difficult.
Right.
And your life has been so difficult. The Roma people are so segregated and so on the fringes. Do you think that there is a shift at all in the way that they are being seen in society?
Good question.
Well, I'd say yes and no. So basically, back in the communist times, most of the Romas had a job, like they were making brooms or making baskets and stuff like that. And once communism fell, that wasn't needed anymore. And so they lost their jobs and what they were doing, but they never moved on past that. They just didn't snap out of that. Yeah. So I think they're still being segregated.
And just a reminder, the Romanian people don't like the Roma people, and the Roma people dislike the Romanian people. And so it's kind of a constant friction between both sides, if you want to say. And to be honest, I haven't seen much movement of integration of the Roma people into Romanian society. They're all considered Romanians, but you have the Romani people and the Romanians that there's differences right down to their skin color, the length of their hair. There are differences and they're visual. And so I think that keeps them segregated. And our prayers that the Romanian people will realize that they just need a chance and an opportunity, and that they're people too. And just despite their lack of finances or lack of education, we all are children of God.
And they do offer now in high schools, and I don't know if universities as well, but they do offer Roma spots. Specifically for Roma children that they can apply for.
But one complication with that is that when the Roma kids fill out their application, a lot of times they don't want to mark the box that they're Roma. Therefore, their applications go through to high school or university as just being a Romanian, which they are, but it then doesn't give them the spot that's being allocated for them.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard balance of like the Roma don't want to say they're Roma because that makes them stand out as Roma.
Yeah.
But because they're Roma, they can advance educationally with the help that they're being given, but they don't know they're being given it. So it kind of gets
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting dynamic, because the social currency that comes with labeling yourself, that can be very difficult to overcome.
Yeah, so we just found out our 8th graders filled out the applications and no one told them, you need to mark that box. If you mark that box, you are more likely to get a spot. And now they haven't marked the box, so they may or may not get in the high school of their choice, because now it's just going by their grades, and their grades may not be as good as the rest of the Romanians because they're not always taught as well.
Right.
So,
and then what's the barrier there of them getting to high school, because their primary education is located in their village, or at least in proximity to their village, correct? But then they don't have high school in their village.
Right. So they can walk to their school until 8th grade. It is right in town. And then the high school is located at least a 30-minute drive. And they just now kind of started a bus system that semi-works and semi-runs on schedule. So it's a big limitation for these kids who, if they want to go, they really need to be able to plan. They need to have the finances. They need to have the parental support.
So in July of 2023, I visited Texas on my first ever trip that was solely for podcast interviews. I had planned to go for a week, but only had one interview set up. And obviously I realized that I needed to maximize my time better. So I put out a call on a Facebook group for guests. And this was the first time I'd ever done anything like this. I had no idea what the outcome would be. I had no idea if anyone would even respond. But to my shock and delight, I actually had people interested. I had quite a few people interested. And as my interviews are done in person, this was brand new territory for me. All of the interviews I'd set up to this point had been with people I knew or had some connection to. So this would be my first time really testing out whether this crazy idea of mine actually had legs. I got messages from people all over the country, even though I had said I was only going to be in Texas, and more specifically in 2 cities in Texas. And it was amazing because I was then able to plan a whole other road trip based on some of the responses later that fall, but that's a different story. So Julie, in this episode, Julie was one of the interviews that I did in Texas, and I was only going to be in Dallas and Austin. And if you're unaware, Texas is a huge state. So Julie was in Lubbock, but she drove to Dallas to do the interview with me. Easily a 7-hour drive. I'm really not that familiar with Texas in general, but that's what Google Maps told me. So I ended up doing 9 interviews for the week. I went from having 1 interview to having 9 interviews for the week, and I was exhausted when it was all said and done, but so incredibly happy. The people I had met were not only wonderful and welcoming, but they understood the idea behind the human experience, and they saw the value in storytelling as they so willingly opened up about their own lives.
My husband at that point, he's working all the time, and I'm still, recovering, and I had, not been able to work for that 1.5 years either. So, our finances are pretty tight. And at that point, he goes, I deserve to get to play softball. That's kind of my outlet. That's what I do for fun and all the things. And he just kind of a little bit, in some ways, just kind of checked out a little bit and went into himself. And he realized really quickly that, Julie will take care of the things here and everything will be fine. And I didn't know any better. That's what I did, and I don't think he put that on me, in order to be detrimental in any way. I think sometimes you just survive the best way that you know how. And he'd always been able to, do what he wanted to do and didn't have anybody he had to answer to. And so here we have a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old. And I'm told, well, he doesn't beat you. I don't know what your problem is, by my mother, is what she was telling me. And yet I feel like there's something not quite right. And we're going to church and everybody's just like, I just love Ricky. He's just such a good guy. And so, I learned stuff a long time ago. So I just stuff it. And my house was built for fear. Boundary was never an option. What was that word? I couldn't use that word anywhere. I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know it existed. So I go to every Bible study known to man. I'm doing all the things, just trying to, and I know something's off in my head. I've known something was off in my head for a long time. But you just go into survival mode. That's what we do. And so in 1993, I pop up pregnant again with my 3rd child. I'm very, very sick. And I think I've got the flu. And I'm like, oh, I've got the flu. And I go to the doctor. He goes, Julie, you're pregnant. And I'm like, nope, tell me it's the flu. And I end up with very high blood pressure. I end up being put to bed in October before he is born in January of 1993. And at this point, I've got, the 2 older kids we're trying to kind of raise, but God knew I needed that little boy. He was, and sometimes he goes, well, I was so surprised you didn't want me. God knew I needed my little redheaded Justin. I enjoyed him as a baby. God restored. I didn't really, the other two were so close together and I was so young that experience was completely different for me. And the nurturing side was just a really special time.
Yeah. Well, with the others, you're very much in survival mode when you have two little ones, right?
Yes. And then you add that accident in on top.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, and at that point we are building a home. And in all the craziness, I know this will sound totally crazy, but we had bought 5 acres of land right next door to my mother's and daddy's 5 acres of land. And I look back at that and go, that makes no sense. And so that's kind of where we are at that point.
It's amazing.
Justin, my youngest, was born in January of 1993. And when I went back for my 4-week checkup, I didn't feel like myself. And like I said, I'd been put to bed with toxemia in October. And it was a hard pregnancy. I only gained 4.5 pounds with that pregnancy. I was sick the entire time. And when I had him, he was 5 pounds, 1.5 ounces. And I brought him home at 4 pounds and 12 ounces.
Wow.
And when I went back for my 4-week postpartum checkup, I was diagnosed with postpartum depression. And so they tried to put me on, a medication at that point. And that was the first time anybody really talked to me about depression. And I'm like, I don't know what this is. I just don't feel like myself. And 2 weeks later, my son comes home from school and he doesn't really feel very good and all of that. Well, come to find out in the process of all of this, my husband had gone in and insurance had gone up and he had canceled our health insurance.
Oh.
And so all of a sudden, here I am, I'm pregnant. We have no health insurance at that point to have that baby. And we still have no health insurance because nobody will pick us up because I got pregnant between health insurance companies.
Right.
And so I'm 4 weeks postpartum and I'm diagnosed with the depression. And 2 weeks later, my son comes home from school and he's not feeling good and all of the things. And he keeps not feeling good and he's throwing up. And I'm like, he's getting dehydrated. And I looked at my husband and I said, I'm taking him to the emergency room. And he goes, you can't, we don't have any insurance. And I said, I don't care. We'll figure it out. But he's going to the emergency room and we get there and his white count is through the roof. And they don't know for sure what's wrong with him. So they take him in for exploratory surgery. And they find that he had a ruptured appendix and gangrene had already set in and he didn't have any of the classic symptoms.
Oh my God.
So here I have a new baby at home, 6 weeks old. And I have a son who has gangrene has set in, had an amazing doctor that took care of him. And he knew our circumstances, that we didn't have insurance. And he had to meet me at the doctor's office after my son went home from the hospital twice to be able to drain the infection that was in his stomach. And he was the most precious doctor ever. And I'm so thankful because today's world, we don't really have doctors that are willing to go that extra mile and understand where you're really at. And so he was actually able to help us have all the medications that we need and help us to drain that. And my son was actually okay by the grace of God.
That's amazing.
But it was a scary, scary time for me as a mom.
Martha's story is incredible. But more than that, Martha is such a light in the darkness. Upon meeting her, I immediately felt as though I had met a friend. She is warmth personified. And you would never know her story is one of pain and abuse just by looking at her. She was one of the people that had initially contacted me when I went to Texas, and she happened to be a stop on my next road trip later that year. She was actually my last stop before I went home, and I had been on the road all month visiting Tennessee, Georgia, North and South Carolina. And I felt so fortunate to be able to even have this experience. But I'd be lying if I said it's not exhausting. I don't know if this is common knowledge. I kind of think it is, but just full disclosure, I do have a day job, an awesome one that allows me to work remotely and travel and do these interviews, but it's a job nonetheless. So I was running pretty close to empty by the time I got to Martha, but all of that went away once I met with her and got to speak with her. To be frank, I do feel that way about all of the interviews that I do. It's a lot of work, the interviews themselves, but all of the logistics of getting to and from these locations, transportation, accommodations, recording space, it all has to be figured out beforehand. And I don't hate it. It can be stressful, but it's not something that I dislike doing. But then the interview happens, and I meet someone for the first time, and I get to sit with them and feel the energy in the room pulse as they speak about their expertise, themselves. And every time I think, I can't believe that I get to do this.
We're literally forfeiting it for the cause. And for this in particular, it was the cause of him, like
Right.
this one person.
Right.
It wasn't for the cause of the greater good. It was the cause of this one person and his egomaniac. Yeah, it was that psychological, again, mindfuck. Like
Yes.
it was feeding his ego.
Yes.
It wasn't for the greater good of any of us.
But everybody thinks it is, right? And that's the difference. And again, I'm just going to say, this kind of is under the umbrella of all abuse. You have one person or one group of people thinking they're working towards one goal, and then you have an abuser that is pretending to work towards the same goal, but ultimately really using the self-sacrifice and the forfeiture of vulnerability, identity, all of it. And obviously it goes too far. You can't be in a relationship with somebody and not be vulnerable, right? That's not a real relationship. But if you have only one side of that relationship being vulnerable and the other side is using that vulnerability to make demands of you or to create a situation in which you are then being abused, then clearly that's wrong. But we don't always know what's happening, right? To your parents, I'm sure it was, I can only imagine how much it must have taken for them to come to terms with what was actually happening versus what they thought they signed up for.
Wow. So that just hit me really hard because literally that was the words that came out of my dad's mouth when he finally made the realization of what had happened to me for the 8 years that I was stuck in the compound. Mm-hmm. He was like, Martha, this is not what we signed up for. That's literally what he said to me. And he had to swallow all of the things from his now adult daughter that his choices had allowed to happen. And his response was, this is not what we signed up for. And it was in that moment where he realized he could no longer be part of this.
Wow.
And it would be a few months of him and my mom having to figure things out to really make that separation. But he knew in that moment that if I was truly being honest with what had happened to me and the things that I had experienced, this is not in any way what he had committed to, even though it had now been 35 years.
Yeah.
Or 30 plus years. So, yeah.
Sure. It is so insidious and it happens. I have so much compassion for your parents. And I think when we talk about cults, there is absolutely this feeling of, and again, I'm just going to draw the line to abusive relationship. There's absolutely this feeling of like, why did how stupid are they? Why did they even join? Why didn't they leave? Because you don't know that this is happening to you. And so I have so much compassion for your parents in that situation. I can only imagine. And when you were talking about him making all of your decisions or having to approve all of the decisions, so when you guys moved, he had to okay that?
He did. And I wish that I could have been a fly on the wall for that conversation because my dad had worked very hard to create this business for his family, and it's what put bread on our tables. And I know that had to have been a very difficult conversation. And I don't know how the conversation went because I've never asked my parents, but I can only imagine that he was probably very guilted in choosing his family and the potential success of this business, that he was getting paid a lot of money to be under contract to make this decision. Or so I've wanted to ask that question of him, because I can't imagine that was an easy decision. But I know that he was guilt ridden and he was guilt laden from Cultman. But I think that Cultman probably also saw dollar signs.
Sure.
Because that's really what it came down to, that each of us were.
Yep.
So if my dad made more money, my dad would then make more money, right? I really feel like that is as simple as it gets, right?
Sure.
I really think he probably saw dollar signs for my dad.
Right.
And that this was but yeah, it was, I'm sure, a very difficult conversation. And I should ask my parents sometimes how that went.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be interested.
It is fascinating, but I agree. It has to be something about, okay, if he's making all of this money, then we're at least going to see a portion of that, because otherwise, and he had to have been so confident. His ego had to have been so big that he was so confident that he could keep that control from a distance. And it's gross, but
And he did.
he did, but it's still gross. It's still his
Yeah.
fault.
Right.
So
I have to say, before we move on, I appreciate that you say that you have compassion for my parents, because that is generally not the experience or the feedback that I receive when I talk about this and when I talk about my parents and what they went through and what we went through. And so I really appreciate you saying that, because I think that it took me, as a survivor of the things that I survived, a really long time to get to that place of compassion for my parents.
yeah.
Because I experienced the
Right.
worst of their decisions, right? And way more so than anybody else in my family. But at the same time, I had to realize that my parents aren't only their decisions, right? Like my parents are a lot more than the decision to join a cult for 30 some years.
JD was another one of my Southeast road trip interviews, but he was one of the first people that reached out to me for an interview, or rather his publicist for his book did. I cannot tell you what a thrill it was to receive that email. Someone, a complete stranger to my knowledge, had found out about my podcast and was interested in it enough to pitch their client as a guest. Talk about surreal. This was another pinch me moment where I realized in real time that I was actually accomplishing my goals. Beyond that, JD was such a pleasure to interview, and he's an incredible advocate for victims of domestic violence, especially male victims who need other men to put a voice to their cause. JD has actually gone on to be a guest and co-host on the radio program I'm a part of called Suffering in Silence, and he will never miss an opportunity to speak out on this issue of abuse. So I'm a huge fan of JD's. I'm a huge fan of his story and all of the advocacy work that he's doing. I'm glad you've had the response that you've had from people,
Yes.
that it's generally been supportive, and that you've had men specifically reaching out.
Yeah. And I think one of the other difficult things for me is the systems, and we could talk for days about the systems, but accepting from a guy's perspective, you're guilty until proven innocent. We come into the court system and others with an inherent bias, and we probably have earned that over the years, right? Just with the physical violence and so forth, so on, being predominantly male dominated. I think it's 7-1. But for the ability for a woman to come in and just say things and it be accepted at face value without any proof, especially her domestic violence charges that she filed, turn in firearms and bullets and ammunition. I'd never even owned a gun.
Yeah.
Or to say he abuses prescription drugs and alcohol. Where's the proof?
Right.
It's accepted at face value.
Right.
And that alarms me, that a lot of us have to spend money to defend ourselves when we've done nothing wrong, when we don't have a system that can't filter through it and go, bring me some proof and then we'll take it to court. But there's no proof here.
Yeah. It is difficult. The validation that you got through your court hearing, and I think that is fabulous. And I know that there are so many people that don't get their day in court or can never prove.
Yeah.
I could never prove my situation. It was never something that I could say besides my word versus his. Now, there weren't accusations of infidelity or substance abuse, but it's difficult. And this is what makes domestic violence so hard, I think. One of the reasons is because you can't prove it a lot of the times.
Right.
It's not, if it's not physical, it is really difficult to prove. And you've got some like really big stories, like your ex-wife went ham with all of it.
She sure did.
She just started throwing everything at the wall.
Yeah.
And not that not everybody has that experience, right? And so I think it's hard too, because our legal system is so behind what domestic violence actually is. And I don't know what the answer is for that. I don't know how to fix that. But even things like stalking. Stalking is a really big one, and it goes hand in hand a lot of times with domestic violence.
Yep.
A lot of times when you leave a situation, and then specifically, there are not enough laws around stalking in general, but then cyber stalking has become a huge issue, and there's like almost nothing for cyber stalking. And so you've got these things that are slipping through the cracks constantly regarding domestic violence, regarding people's welfare, their ability to move forward in life, and there is no help for them.
Right.
There's nothing.
Yeah, and it's lack of resources. And as I look at the system, though, the frustrating part is it's a system we pay for.
Mm-hmm.
Us taxpayers fund it. So let's reappropriate some funds, perhaps. And instead of, I had to wait 13 months for a 45-minute hearing on a motion that we filed. So, yeah, I got my day in court.
Yeah.
I didn't get the ruling I should have gotten. The judge failed to uphold the law. And it's laid out in the book. But if the courts are that backlogged, then let's build more courts. Let's hire more judges, or let's look at the stuff up front. And there could be a committee or a bar or something that looks at the evidence before it goes forward for a hearing.
Sure.
There's got to be a hurdle that you have to clear versus you'll get your day in court.
And it is so frustrating too, because the way that our system is built is for things to not go to court, right?
Right.
And so it's all a big game. And when you are a victim, and not just of domestic violence, anything, of victim, that you don't want to think of that as a game that these bigger players are playing on this chessboard with your life and your well-being. But unfortunately, a lot of times that's what it ends up being.
And they're all getting paid along the way, and zero accountability. Win or lose, the family attorneys are going to get paid.
Yep.
They all know each other, which bothered me. They're all chuckling with each other in the hallways and stuff in between the hearings. And the judges are former attorneys and this and that. And if you can avoid the system, stay out of the system.
Yeah, truly.
For sure.
Truly. Yeah, it's all difficult. There is no cut and dry way to deal with domestic violence. And again, I think that's what makes it so difficult. There is no real justice in the law for domestic violence victims, I would say 99% of the time. And even with you, like you said, you got your day in court, but it wasn't what it should have been. So even if you do get it, it doesn't make up for what has happened.
Yeah.
And I would say that, again, any victim of a crime would feel the same way about that. It really is an underwhelming part of seeking justice. And you do have to, at some point, let it go and give it away.
You do. And this is what I've said to others, is that throughout this journey, the mind is where the battle begins. And you can let this crush you and fall into a self-pity victimization mode, or you can look at it and find purpose in it and find gratitude and be thankful that it happened. So we all have pain to deal with. We all have our crosses to bear, and it's just a matter of finding the purpose in it and doing something good with it.
I feel just so incredibly fortunate to be sitting here and to be looking back over the past couple of years at these stories and these interviews that literally would not be possible without all of the people involved. I'm so grateful that people are willing to give this much of themselves in an effort to foster genuine and authentic connection and vulnerability and community. I believe in it so much, but it's still something that I'm in awe of whenever anybody steps up and is just willing to go that extra mile. So, I mean, these stories have had an effect on so many. I have heard from so many of you over the past few years, and I feel incredibly privileged to be able to platform them, and that their tellers have trusted me with some of their most vulnerable pieces. But I feel even more humbled by all the things that aren't on the show. The hospitality, the hugs, the understanding, the support, the love, the friendship. This podcast has healed and continues to heal my faith in humanity. I see the divine in every person I encounter. And to me, it is the encapsulation of God's creation being good. I hope these stories inspire you, move you, help you. I hope that through them, we all experience the courage to share and the enthusiasm to listen. Please join me on Substack and Instagram to follow along on this journey and to join others in the community. Do good and love well.